Before I jump into the sermon this morning, I want to take a second. Tim and Pam Green, would you all stand, please? Y'all may not know this, but Tim and Pam Green are responsible for our bus ministry. They get here every morning very early. They drive around. They pick up our brothers and sisters who can no longer drive themselves. There are a lot of people in this room that would not be here if it weren't for their work. So I want to thank you, Pam and Tim, so much for your hard work and dedication. Thank you. All right. When Moses and the people of Israel arrived at the border of the land, he chose out one from every tribe and sent them to explore Canaan. And he said, go through the Negev and on into the hill country, see what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good land? Is it bad? What kind of towns do they have? Are they fortified or unwalled? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. So the spies went up and they explored the land from top to bottom. They went through all of the hill country down to the coast. And when they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. And two of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it indeed flows with milk and honey. Here is some of its fruit. But the people who live there, they are powerful, and their cities are fortified. The Amalekites live there, and Anak and his descendants. They're like giants. They're all over the land, and the people began to tremble. But then Caleb stepped up, and he silenced the people. And he said, we should go and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the other men who had gone up with him said, there's no way we can attack these people. They are stronger than we are. They are bigger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that God had brought them to. They said, the land we explored, it devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are giants. The Nephilim, the heroes of old, are there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Throughout the summer, we've been, if you'll change the slide to Exodus 34, 6, and 7. Throughout the summer, we've been examining this passage. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the sins of the fathers and the children and their children, the third and fourth generation. This has become one of my favorite verses in the scriptures, because in it we see that our God is a compassionate God, one who is deeply concerned with his people. He is so concerned with us that he's often forced to act on our behalf and for our good. He is a gracious God, a God who is highly motivated. He is highly motivated to especially richly bless his people, despite the obvious fact that we often do not deserve it. It teaches us that our God is slow to anger or long-suffering, that he endures our faithlessness, our wickedness, rebellion, and sin, that he endures the shame that these things bring upon him, that he endures despite our unfounded mistreatment and mistrust of him. This verse teaches us that our God abounds in fragrant and loyal love towards his people, that the treatment of his people surpasses our wildest hopes and dreams, that his love for his people is new every morning. Brothers and sisters, he treats us like favored sons and daughters, bringing us into his house, treating us as we do not deserve. Further, he is always faithful to his covenant, doing exactly as he says, we, church, can depend completely, without reservation, on every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of our God. We can be certain that he will uphold his word. Our God is not quick to punish, but rather he concerns himself with maintaining this deep and fragrant, this loyal love towards us. He kindles the flames of this loyalty. He works diligently, even in our faithlessness. Our God is quick to forgive all our wickedness, that deep guilt and shame which readily stains us. He's quick to forgive all our rebellion, violations of both divine and mortal law. He is a God who forgives us even in our sin, when we fail to do what we should, or when we fail to live up to his design and his expectations. This verse especially has taught me a deep, abiding love of our God because of the things he does on our behalf. He is a great God who from the very beginning has done good and mighty works among his people to the praise and glory of his name. Yet, all of that is often forgotten when we arrive at this last portion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. There might as well be nothing else on that board. All of these wonderful things that our God is on our behalf, and we throw it all out the window because of this last part. Especially in our individualistic culture, this is a very difficult concept for us to understand. We read this verse and we say, what? Okay, yeah, he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Okay, yeah, I can get on board with that. They're bad people and they deserve punishment. And of course, our God's going to see to that. So I might be able to get on board with that. But wait a minute. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents, the third and fourth generation? What? This trait seems abhorrent to us. Especially in this culture, the most individualistic culture on the planet. It is not right to punish other people for things they did not do. So this morning, we're going to examine these questions. We're going to examine how our righteous God can punish those who are not guilty, and how God's punishment meshes with all of these other character traits. Ultimately, we're going to ask the question that this tension breeds here. Who is our God? Is our God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, sin? Is our God a loving Father? Or rather, is our God a kid with a magnifying glass and an ant pile? This morning, we're going to examine these questions through Numbers chapter 14, so that as children of God, we may take solace in who our God is and confidently proclaim the love our Creator has for all of his people. So if you turn in your Bibles to Numbers chapter 14, as usual, not all of the scriptures are going to be on the board. So if you'll turn over to Numbers chapter 14, we're going to dig into the text. So Numbers chapter 14 picks up right after what we just talked about. The spies go into the land, they come back, and the spies bring a bad report about the land. They see all of the trouble, all of the problems in the land, and they go, there's nothing we can do to overcome this. And so, spreading that bad report in chapter 14, verse 1, that night all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. They raised their voices and wept aloud because for the past 18 months, possibly 2 years, the Israelites have been coming to this land. God brought them out of Egypt with the intent of giving them this land. He has told them time and time again on the way to this land that he's going to give it to them. And so they arrive at the border. They're finally about to leave the wilderness behind. They send spies in the land, and it seems like God's word was false. It seems like the promises God has made are empty. How could they possibly overcome giants? How could they possibly overcome the heroes of old? That's what the inhabitants of the land looked like. So what are they going to do in the face of this problem? Well, there's nothing that can be done. And so the Israelites raise their voices and weep aloud. In verse 2, all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly. What do you think they were saying when they grumbled against Moses and Aaron? All this way for what? Why are we even here? God has abandoned us. God's not going to do what he promised, and these two yahoos have been yanking our chain the whole way. They said, if we only had died in Egypt or in this wilderness, because being dead is better than being alive for some reason. Why is the Lord, in verse 3, bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? The battle's lost before it's even started. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? What they're doing here, church, is they're looking at the things God has said. They're not just looking at the problems. It's easy to get wrapped up in problems. It's easy to get wrapped up in all of these things going on. And we've experienced that over the last few years, haven't we? It seems like our country has reeled from disaster to disaster to disaster. And just in case you were curious, I'm sure if you hold your breath and wait 5 minutes, the news will convince you that there is another disaster coming down the road. Another reason you ought to be terrified. And I would bet you in 20 years, it's going to be the same exact thing. I would challenge you. We don't have to wait 20 years. Go back and look at newspapers from the 1800s. Go back and look at newspapers from the 1900s. You'll find a trend that our American media has always camped out on disaster, on calamity, on evil. They don't care about what God has said. They don't care what God has promised. They want to focus on that bad report. And they want you to invest your lives in it. But see, it's not just a lost world focusing in on the negative. That's not what's happening here. You have to remember, these are people who were led out of Egypt with power and might, with great signs and wonders, the like of which have never been seen. It's been about 2 years since they left Egypt, okay? In 38 years, when they eventually come back to the land and their children get to inherit it, there are people in the land who still know what God did 40 years ago. God laid low Egypt, which at this time was the most powerful country on the planet. And he laid them low with 10 plagues, made a mockery of their gods. These are people who have eaten manna from heaven, bread from heaven, given to them by God. They have been led through the desert by a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. They have seen God work on their behalf over and over and over again. And yet now that they come to the land, when they are on the cusp of receiving what God has promised, this is their reaction. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? Or verse 4, and they said to each other, we should choose a leader. In verse 3, wouldn't it be better to go back to Egypt? And then in verse 4, the same. We should choose a leader. So in other words, we should reject Moses and Aaron, Caleb and Joshua, and all these people who are saying things that we disagree with. We should choose someone to take us right back, because it was so much better there. Moses and Aaron's reaction in verse 5 is rather telling. Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua and Caleb, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes. Why? Because they recognized the gravity of the situation. Church, you never want to be with a group of people who are saying God's not going to come through on his promises. You don't want to be in that group. You don't want to look at our God who sacrificed his son on the cross and say, Father, I understand that you promised A, B, and C, but you don't understand. You can't do A, B, and C. That's not a good place to be, church. And Moses and Aaron, Joshua and Caleb recognize that. And so they fall face down in front of the whole Israelite community. Joshua and Caleb tear their clothes and they plead with the assembly. You don't understand, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. God doesn't give bad promises. It's a land flowing with milk and honey, and He's going to give it to us. Do not rebel. And that's the crux of it, church. This people who have made a covenant with God, who have willingly placed themselves under Him, who have seen Him act time and time again on their behalf, this people have decided to rebel against God. Think about what God is doing. God isn't just bored. God isn't like, well, the first round of creation at the Garden of Eden didn't work out, so I'm just going to pick them, and we're going to march around the desert for 2 years, and I'll just do stuff with them. I don't have a plan or anything. We know this side of the cross that God is actually doing something, that He is bringing redemption to all mankind through Israel. Think of what they are really saying here. Think of what is truly at stake here. They're not just merely saying, God, we don't want to go along with it. They are looking at God and His divine plan and saying, no thanks, we don't want any part of it. That's truly what's at stake. And there's no excuse for it. There's no excuse for this rebellion. And so in verse 9 they say, only do not rebel against the Lord and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone. The Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. There comes a point in time, church, where our flawed perception convinces us of things that are just not true. And even the Word of God, when spoken for our good, falls on deaf ears because we think we know better. They remind the people of the land who is on their side. They remind the people of Israel who is in their corner and what He has promised. And what's their reaction? Verse 10, but the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Well, we're this far, we might as well double down. Not only are we going to reject God and His plan and everything, but we're going to kill His leaders. We're going to kill the people He has sent to us. What you'll find throughout the rest of the scriptures is this is a common theme in Israel. Israel will routinely persecute and even murder the men that God sends to them. The culmination of this, of course, is Christ Himself. But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. I'd love to be like the fly on the tent when that happened and see the look on their face. I imagine it's very similar to my own children. If you don't know, I've got 5. And I know that seems insane, but I have 5. And when they all get together in the living room and start playing, they don't hear anything. They get totally consumed in what they're doing. They have no idea. And I can be pretty quiet when I walk. And so I will hear this ruckus and this noise, and I'll get up and I'll go walk out there, and I'll stand there like this, looking at them all in their mischief and misbehavior. And eventually, one of them will turn and see me. And the effect it has on them is hilarious. My daughter, Allison, she'll go like this. And she'll just freeze and stand there like, maybe if I don't move, he won't see me. And then the others will see what she's doing, and they'll immediately start doing this number because they know what's about to happen. I imagine for the Israelites, it's very similar when the glory of the Lord descends upon them. In verse 11, Numbers 14, the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? Something I hear from time to time, church, from members of the church, is a doubt a doubt concerning the promises of our God. What do I mean by this? I'm sure you've heard this before. Yes, we're saved, but we're saved by the skin of our teeth. You ever heard that before? Oh, yeah. No, we've got God's salvation, but church, this isn't humble. This isn't humility. This is rebellion. When we look at the things God has promised, when we look at the things that God has said, this is yours, church. When we look at those promises and we look at God and we say, yeah, but no. That is not in any way a good thing. And in fact is rebellion. When we look at God and he says, everything you need will be added unto you if you pursue my righteousness. And we go, yeah, but I got to work on Sundays, God. What you provide is not good enough, right? When we look at God and we say, no, I understand that's what you promised, but it's not really how it works. I've got to make sure that I go and I do this, and I do this, and I do this, and I do this, or I'm not going to have the things that I need. Church, I would submit to you that what we're really doing in that moment is rebellion. We are looking at the promises that God has made, and we're saying, I can't trust that. I can't follow that. I can't do that. There are lots of ways that this manifests. It manifests in forgiveness. It manifests for as many promises as there are. We look at these things that God says and we say they just can't be. Look at the reaction that God has in Numbers 14. How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? Understand what we're doing, church, when we say things like that. Understand what we're doing when we doubt his forgiveness, when we doubt his goodness, when we doubt that he's going to provide what we need. Understand what we are taking on, and also understand, church, we have more assurance than they ever did. Because in each and every one of us, we have the Spirit of God dwelling in us if we have obeyed the gospel. We have his Spirit moving our hearts and our minds and pushing us to do the things that we know we ought to do. And when we doubt his promises, when we doubt his word, we are resisting that Spirit. We are resisting him. God looks at this and he says in verse 12, I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them. But I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they. Now from verse 13 to 19, Moses is going to intercede. And he says in verse 17, now may the Lord's strength be displayed just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion. Think of the horror of what these people just did. Knowing full well what God has done, knowing full well what God has promised, and they spit in his face. Moreover, they've done so at least 10 times since they've left Egypt. But look at what Moses says here. Now may the Lord's strength be displayed, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents of the third and fourth generation. Based on that statement and the way we view it, these people are toast. Right? They're toast. God's going to smoke them. He's going to bring his righteous hammer down upon them. Look at what he says in 19. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. There comes a point in time with my kids where I am totally done. And I've reached that point a couple of times this past week. I'm kind of a clean freak, if you didn't know. And when you have 5 kids, a strong barrier to having a clean house is the 5 kids. And so they don't do a good job cleaning either. You can't trust them to do it. And so I have, this week especially has been bad for some reason. And I've said to them repeatedly, I am done. I have had it. You know what you're supposed to be doing. You don't do it. I am done. And when we read Exodus 34, 6 and 7, that's what we see. Because that's how we behave. I told you what I told you. I've done it time and time again, and you keep breaking the rule, so I'm done. Church, thanks be to God that he is not like us. Change it to verse 20. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. See, Moses is an intercessor, just like Christ is an intercessor. Just like we, church, should be intercessors on behalf of the world. That's what priests do. Priests intercede between God and the people. And we are royal priests in the vein of Christ. But the ultimate point that I'm making here, go back to Exodus 34, 6 and 7, is that if we put this statement on a scale, and we took the first part that we love so much, and we put the second part, and we put them on different sides of the scale, his love, his compassion, his long suffering, all of those things far outweigh his desire to punish. In fact, what we find in the scriptures time and time again is that God doesn't want to destroy us. Rather, he wants to save us. Now here in Numbers 14, you know that it doesn't end with his forgiveness. He does forgive them based on Moses' appeal. But forgiveness does not mean that they won't suffer consequences. Forgiveness does not mean that we will be spared consequences. And in verse 21, everyone who witnessed the glory and signs performed in Egypt, yet rebelled and tested him, not a single one will enter the land. That's a consequence for their rebellion. Further, the people will be turned back to the desert, where they will spend another 38 years there, where every single person over the age of 20 who witnessed the signs of God will die. Their children, however, will enter the land. Now, wait a minute. Exodus 34, 6 and 7 says, yet he doesn't leave the guilty unpunished, and he punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents of the third and fourth generation. So what gives? Here in Numbers 14, severe rebellion, and God spares the children. Not only that, he blesses them. There are 7 rebellions in the book of Numbers, and the way God deals with each one is unique. We don't have time this morning to review every single one. But what we need to understand is what this statement is not a matter of fact every time this is the way the code works. Rather, what this statement is an assurance that if you continue to rebel, if you continue to reject God, if you continue to doubt what he will do, he will punish. Just as surely if you turn and repent and seek him and forsake evil, he will forgive. That's what this statement is all about, church. This is a wonderful, endearing statement. But because of our culture and because of our perspective on things, we can't see the forest for the trees. Go ahead and change it to the last slide. Church, we need to know our God is awesome, that he is loving, he is deeply compassionate, that he is a father who is patient towards all of his creation and his children. But he will not ignore wrongdoing. God's forgiveness does not exempt us from the consequences of our wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Further, God's forgiveness does not exempt our families and communities from suffering. The people will wander in the desert for 38 years. The children who are under 20 had no say in the matter. They will suffer because of their parents' sin. Just like if I went out and robbed a bank today and got shot for my trouble, my family would suffer from my sin. Our sin is not an easy thing. Our sin causes our community and our families to suffer. The Israelites here learned this lesson the hard way, and they'll learn it again and again and again throughout the book of Numbers. Indeed, many people and families in Israel suffer for the failures of their judges, their prophets, and their kings. The lesson we should learn from this, church, is that sin is as horrible as our God is awesome. And our God holds back chaos from destroying us. But if we set our minds on evil, if we set our minds on chaos, if we seek to rule without God or in spite of him, if we disregard our God's patience and loving kindness, we should not be surprised that calamity will befall us. Indeed, not only us, but our wickedness will impact our communities, our families, and even our children. Therefore, church, let us cling to our God and his promises. Let us be a people who take care of the oppressed and the disadvantaged. Let us be a people who serve our community. Let us be a people who are known by their love and service to one another, because it's in these things that we truly reflect who our God is. And church, let us be quick to put off all sin. The consequences of the sin that we hold are terrible, and we can be sure that God is going to punish those things. So this morning, if you have not repented of your sins, if you have not obeyed the gospel of Christ, if you've never heard that you should obey the gospel of Christ, or if you have no idea what I'm talking about, or maybe this morning you're here and you've doubted the promises of God, maybe you've bought into the lie of the world that our God is powerless and can do nothing, I want to encourage you. I'm going to be right back there in the prayer room. We have elders standing up in the back of the room. If you need to obey the gospel this morning, or if you're in need of prayer, I ask that you come as we stand and as